Hi everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be responding to this video that I saw on TikTok because I am always on TikTok. And this TikTok talks about the biological differences between men and women, and then it talks about how that affects sporting performance. And I'm going to be giving you some evidence as to why this video is full of silly sausage arguments, and why as coaches and athletes and people who consume sport, we need to do better. And we can only do better if we know better and we're exposed to the science and the other side of the argument. I've wanted to make a video on this topic for a while, but I'm conscious that it's a sensitive subject and that it needs to be done well. So I've procrastinated it, but I've come to the conclusion that I'm never going to be able to say what I want to perfectly, so we're just going to do it. So I thought providing rebuttals to this TikTok would be a really good way of structuring the video and then kind of hitting some of those chart-topping arguments. The arguments the woman in this video makes tries to explain why women get injured more often in sport and why they don't have the same physical capabilities as their male counterparts. And I understand this correctly. The presenter is talking about all of the issues that come from female biology that are present even when testosterone is relatively low. I'm assuming she's saying this is part of like an anti-trans women in sport rhetoric, so I promise you we're going to challenge the crap out of that today. Small disclaimer before we start though, I have very little context to this video. I only watched this clip, I didn't watch the whole podcast, so if the hosts or the guests provide more evidence or give more context that I'm not aware of, let me know down below. But just for the purpose of this video, I'm not responding to the full thing, just this little clip that I've seen. Now let's get into it. So let's begin here. How heavy you are is absolutely a contributor to how powerful you can be. That's why we have things like weight classes in boxing or in powerlifting. It's a pretty simple concept. The more weight you have, the more potential force you're able to exert. But it depends on what kind of weight you have and how you use it. So when this presenter says that weight is the same or equal, like in this situation, and then they attribute that lack of power to a sex-based characteristic, that is bad science. Within exercise science research, weight, or as it should more appropriately be referred to as mass, does not tell us enough information, and it doesn't protect us enough from the confounding variables. It's not as simple as saying, well, if weight was kept the same, then the difference of performance is obviously because of the sex of the individual. With this, you could have a man who is 70 kilos with 3% body fat, and a woman who is 70 kilos with 45% body fat. They both weigh the same, but one has significantly more tissue, muscle, which could help them to exert more power. We need to consider things like lean muscle mass and the cross-sectional area, or the CSA of the muscle, which is the size of the muscle fiber relative to its length. Because when we consider factors like CSA, the strength and power performance differences between the sexes are almost non-existent. And there are a few more things that can contribute to power output, like movement quality and training experience. And access to those things might be affected by your gender expression and society's expectations of you, but none of which are exclusive to what type of biology you have. We're going to explore more throughout this video about how gender could actually be a bigger contributing factor to performance rather than the biology. This point raises a really big issue that we see consistently throughout exercise science. It's the idea that traits like strength, power, tissue adaptations, hypertrophy, or neuromuscular control, it's the assumption that these traits are not modifiable, but they are. Research that does not account for the fact that these qualities can improve in response to training is failing women and girls. Being assigned female at birth does not inherently mean that you are weaker than your male counterparts. Women, like men, have the ability to train and to improve their bone mineral density, because bone is a tissue which adapts, like any other tissue, to the load that we put on it. If we don't put enough load on our bones, like if we were on bed rest, then our bone density would decrease. Bones are really complex structures, and there are so many biomechanical considerations that make up that bone health and strength. These are things like compressive strength, the increased geometric adaptation, increased stiffness, the collagen properties, and more. And all of those things can create strong bones without meaningful changes in the bone mineral density. To paraphrase Fonseca et al., it is remarkable that we still use bone density as a measure of bone health or strength, when we can see improvements in mechanical bone properties without changes in bone density. So your bone mineral density might not change, all of those other things that I listed might, and our bones will be stronger. And we found that out nearly 10 years ago. So when this presenter says, oh well, female bone structure, which is just less dense, One, density is a poor metric for bone strength, and two, it just doesn't provide us with enough information. Being less dense, but being strong and consistently trained will likely mean that if you're hit, you're not going to explode into 1,000 pieces and shatter like a piece of glass. The next question that I would ask this woman in the video is, what groups of men and women are we talking about, and what sports are we looking at? If we're talking about athletes in high impact sports, they can have a 5 to 30% higher bone mineral density than non-athletes. But athletes in low impact sports like cycling, on the other hand, seem not to present above those normal levels of bone mineral density. The presenter said hit, so I'm assuming they're talking about something like boxing, but again, there are more factors that we need to consider than density or your weight. And on that list of things to consider that we've come up with so far, that's things like training experience, movement quality, gender expression and societal expectations, compressive strength, and cross-sectional area of your muscles. But to sum up that point, bone mineral density is definitely something that can improve. It differs widely amongst competitive athletes, and it's not even the most substantial contributor to bone strength. And once again, it is not an indisputable biological truth like this person is presenting it to be. Q angles are the bane of my existence. They don't really explain it here, but essentially it's the angle between your quadriceps muscles and the patella tendon. I have been taught about Q angles in my bachelor's, in my master's, and throughout nearly every professional qualification that I have ever done. It's used as the reason as to why women get more knee injuries than men, and why they can't move as well during jumping or landing tasks. But in 2005, nearly 20 years ago, researchers found that the slight difference between Q angles in men and women disappeared once we took height into the equation. We found that men and women of equal height demonstrated similar Q angles, with taller people having slightly smaller Q angles. The slight difference in Q angles between men and women can be explained by the fact that men tend to be taller. There is no real sex-based difference in Q angles. Stop presenting it as such, and stop using it as a reason to treat women as a special population in sports. And stop quoting and pushing forth research that approaches hypotheses from a strictly biological point of view, because it's not good enough. And we see it time and time again. For example, when the Australian Rules Football League was experiencing high ACL injury rates, the league's default response was to investigate the association with the menstrual cycle. By doing this, it frames women's sport participation as dangerous, inherently due to female biology. More clearly, Parsons et al. Articulated this really well. It demonstrates a wider, gendered, social context of labeling women's bodies as not being naturally fit for sport. More so, it relies on the normative assumptions of what a woman's body is or should be, and it doesn't hold space for those individuals beyond the sex binary. I think that is an incredibly powerful statement. But you know what? For the sake of the argument, let's give this presenter the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that research does say that there is a crystal clear difference in Q angles between men and women. If a woman's anatomy and simply the size of her hips or her hormones can put her at higher risk of injury, then we should see women having 6 times as many knee injuries as men across all environments, right? But guess what? We don't. After people have knee surgeries, 1 in 5 individuals suffer re-injury to either knee. But after ACL reconstructions, male individuals are more prone to re-injury, with young men being substantially more likely than females of the same age to re-injure themselves. And before anybody says, well, it's because young men go back to sport more often than young women do, in the study that I'm referencing, there was no significant difference in the return to sport rates. So that's not it. If the cause of injury was simply because of female biology, then instead we would see young women having the highest rates of re-injury, because that would be consistent with this train of logic. So clearly something deeper is going on. What I think is happening is that post-operatively, what could contribute to this change in injury prevalence is that women are put into rehabilitation environments with physiotherapists and healthcare professionals who give them dedicated time and effort to help them recover, get back to health, and help them return to function. Prior to injury, it's not a leap to assume that dedicated strength or conditioning or access to these kinds of support staff would be limited. And that's because even at a professional level, the amount of staff and resources women's sports have access to is laughably poor. And even at a professional level, that's not an isolated environment. We still live in the same society that puts different expectations on men and women. And that is a bigger bloody issue than Q angles, lack of testosterone, or female biology. One of the most common arguments surrounding surrounding the Q angle is that a higher Q angle creates instability of the knee joint, and that's why it could contribute to an increased risk of injury for women. But the ability to exert strength and to exert control over our joints is more important. If we look at this, when we increase our strength, our risk of ACL injury goes way down. And the ability to control your limbs or to illustrate that leg dexterity actually changes depending on what level of sports you compete in. Amongst recreational men and women, you can see here that there is a huge difference in leg dexterity. But amongst elite athletes, this difference almost completely disappears. And this is likely indicative of the fact that time, resources, and social support given at an elite level is way closer to being equal between men and women than it would be at a recreational level. So much of the research in exercise science compares untrained men and women, like college students, because that's who we have access to. And so when you're comparing untrained men and women, you're assuming that both genders are starting from the same place, but evidently they're not. And this leads to erroneous conclusions being drawn, and it unfortunately leads to researchers drawing conclusions and attributing differences in performance to biology. But it's more likely that we see these results because we live in a world with different gendered societal expectations placed on men and women. When I say this, I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that young boys generally have access to a wider range of sports, or they have access to more recreational teams. They're actively encouraged to be big and strong. But young girls outside of a competitive and elite environment don't have that same support, and they're often critiqued if they showcase that super muscular body type. Another example of how there's more going on than meets the eye is this paper. It shows the difference in load that goes through your knee when you're a high-level player compared to the low-level players. And what we see is that the low-level players have more forces going through their knee in a potentially unsafe position, which could make them more likely to experience an injury. So right there, the issue that we see isn't the sex of the athlete, it's the skill. The low-level athletes haven't been taught how to move or how to use their body effectively, and they haven't been taught the most efficient way to move for a specific game situation. It's not because they were assigned female at birth that they just magically get injured more often. And even in my own coaching experience, I've heard things like this perpetuated. I've heard people saying we need to train young girls differently to young boys because they biologically have worse landing mechanics or worse control of their limbs. I've been at a doctor and told that my hips were too wide and that I should stop playing hockey and I should start child rearing, and I wish I was joking. And so to the people who say things like this, I want to say, listen up, punks. I'm going to read you this excerpt from a paper that so eloquently summarizes this point that I'm trying to make. Sociocultural factors differently affect accumulated motor experience, practice opportunities, and focus of attention in females, leading to differences in motor skill that can confound the comparison of female and male movements. This is saying that it is not simple enough to look at anatomy or sex as a differentiator for performance, because societal expectations of people who have a feminine gender expression can impact your motor skill. The findings of this support the hypothesis that such sex differences in athletic performance are likely to diminish or disappear with increasing skill. In everyday movement tasks, however, where level of skill is a less meaningful dimension than in sport, differences in movement patterns observed between females and males point instead to the influence of subtle societal expectations on movement patterns. I'm going to say it loudly and clearly once more for everyone in the back. We need to increase the skill and invest more time in our women and girls. When we do this, the differences between boys and girls in their movement and their athletic performance disappears. Movement isn't biology, it is a skill. It is a modifiable, learnable, and trainable skill. Now let's look at the actual injury rate, since this presenter brought up the 6 times more likely to injure themselves statistic. Amongst fully professional soccer players, the incidence of ACL injuries in women over 4 seasons is 1.35%. For fully professional men's team, over a year, it was a 1.42% incidence rate. I have seen some papers where they break it down in terms of injury to hours exposed to training in matches and that ratio. And in those cases, I have seen the statistic for women's injuries come out slightly higher, even at a professional level, but it's nowhere near 6 times as many. I think that 6 times statistic might be coming from a recreational level or an untrained population, because like I've just shown you guys, that's where we see the difference in skill, the difference in load that goes through your knees, and the difference in control. And when you see those higher rates, though it can be really tempting, we can't leap to the assumption that it is a sex-based problem, particularly not when we have all of the information that I've just showed you, indicating the huge impact that all of these factors have on our movement quality and our injury risk. And the majority of them, bar the social expectations, are modifiable. So by trying to communicate that the size of a woman's hips in comparison to her knees puts her at higher risk of injury, you are saying that women's bodies are not naturally fit for sport and there's nothing that they can do about it. And that is not accurate and it's not fair. Power, again, is a modifiable attribute. And once more, body size and dynamic strength are the major factors explaining the explosive leg power difference between men and women. It is not a specific or unique sex quality. They said gender, but they mean sex, and there is a difference. If the people in this TikTok were genuinely interested in trying to protect women's sports and fighting for them, then they need to stop making blanket statements like this that help no one. They need to ask questions of the research that they're referencing. For example, what athletes are being studied? Are they at the same level of competition? Do they have access to the same resources? Are they strength matched? Do they have the same amount of lean body mass? Are they the same height? These considerations matter. All of these points that that woman has made have nothing to do with testosterone, so she's right there. But they also have nothing to do with female biology, as I've just shown you throughout this video. Not a single argument that this person has made stands up to scrutiny under closer inspection. It can all be chalked up to poor science. And I might be wrong, but I'm assuming the presenter is making this argument to say that trans women in sport would have an unfair advantage simply because they were assigned male at birth. But this isn't the case. According to this bioethicist at Yale University who works on the sex testing regulations in sport, there is no evidence that going through a male typical puberty will necessarily give trans women or trans feminine individuals an advantage over cis women. So listen really carefully to what I'm about to say. Trans women are women, and what people don't understand is that by not fighting for trans rights, you're failing both cisgendered and transgendered women. When the IOC sets limits on testosterone levels in the female category, they're setting limits on all women. Cisgendered athletes can be affected by that too. They're stopping athletes like Caster Semenya from competing due to her naturally high testosterone levels. Caster was raised as a girl and is legally identified as a woman her entire life. Yet because governing bodies are insisting on imposing rules about what a woman should be and can be, here we are. And as a side note, trans athletes have been able to compete in the Olympics since 2004. And guess what? Since then, over all the Olympics that have taken place since 2004, there's been no overtaking of women's sports by trans women. And just to cover my bases here, I'm not saying that testosterone is not a powerful anabolic agent, because it absolutely is. Testosterone will help somebody to have higher amounts of lean muscle mass. It'll help somebody train more and harder, and consequently, it'll help you have higher levels of strength and power. But we don't live in a magical world where everything is tightly controlled, and testosterone and other aspects of biology are the only factors differentiating the male and female sporting experience. We actually live in a world where gender expression and sex is on a spectrum. It's not a binary. Some women have higher levels of testosterone. Some men have higher Q angles. Some men are taller. Some women have broader shoulders. We do live in a world where women and girls are told not to pick up weights because they're going to get too bulky, where muscles on women is generally frowned down upon, where young girls are shouted at sporting events for being too masculine and performing too well. And as a result, young girls and women have to choose between high performance or societal acceptance. We live in a world where the majority of sports coaches are men. Only 13% of coaches at the Tokyo Olympics were women, and I think this was up from 11% at the Olympics before. And that statistic doesn't differentiate between super feminine presenting women or masked women. And so consistently the role models within sport are lacking. And that's not a shock, right? We live in a world where the media coverage of women's sports only makes up 13% of all of the sports coverage, and only 10% of the sports journalists are women. And within that media coverage, women are disproportionately sexualized and objectified based on their appearance. The most common words combined with women in sport in the media are aged, older, pregnant, unmarried, and married. Whereas for men, the most common words combined with men in sport are fastest, strong, big, real, and great. We live in a world where female athletes have to fight for their right for fair compensation, and therefore the message that is continuously spread is that sports are not a place for women. So yes, testosterone levels are absolutely a contributor to sporting performance, but so are all these other things. And as a society and within exercise science, we need to move away from framing injuries and performance as an inherent sex-based fact of life, because they're not. Instead, we need to consider how performance and injuries are impacted by the pervasive gendered environment that we all live in. In other words, there are so many things that we need to consider before anatomy, physiology, biology, before any of those things are even mentioned. If you only consider biology, you're assuming that any untrained man could walk off the street and beat an elite athlete at the top of her field. And if you can't hear how unbelievably reductionist and sexist that is, then I don't know what to tell you. My old professor has an incredible analogy for this. Worrying about biology before focusing on things like training protocols, how to improve your strength and power, and optimizing your nutrition is like driving in a glass car and then worrying about your seatbelt. There are so many things we need to focus on first and to get right first. So make it make sense. It does make sense to focus purely on biology if you're trying to be misogynistic or transphobic though, but you should quit that because it's not scientific and it's rude. To make it more scientific and to improve our exercise science and the results that we draw from it, we need to stop assuming that men and women are coming from the same starting place, particularly at that recreational level, because unfortunately, once again, they're not. And all of this that I've mentioned today has not even touched on the unique challenges faced by the queer community in sport or by women of color. That could be another video in and of itself. And now, while this has been a bit doom and gloom, I do want to highlight that the world is changing and that people are slowly putting their money where their mouth is and realizing that something is wrong and that sports are sexist. People are supporting women's sports at record numbers, and women are continuing to put in dominant athletic performances despite all of these challenges and despite bad scientists trying to convince them that they can't improve or they shouldn't even try. There is no shortage of incredible athletes who have left long-lasting impact on our sport and our world. So if you are a woman or a girl interested in sport, keep it the up, because we need you. We need you to join this amazing group of women. And though it might be hard to find at first, there are no shortage of people in your corner. And you deserve to have access to coaches who understand that skill, strength, power, and movement are modifiable, trainable, and learnable. And you need to understand that your body is completely fit for sport just the way it is. And that is it for me today, guys. I hope I have got my message across, and I hope this has maybe made you look at things a little bit differently. And I hope this goes without saying, but please be kind in the comments to yourself and to others. I will be deleting comments that are cruel or unkind. But if you have genuine questions and you want to have a discussion or you want to challenge any of the points that I've made and you do it in a respectful way, then please do, because I'd love to have these difficult conversations. We're not going to get anywhere if we don't. I think I've realized that I'm never going to say what I need to say perfectly, and I'm always going to think of other arguments. Like after I post this, I'm going to be saying, oh, well, I should have said this, I should have said that. So I just wanted to get this out there and get it out there in the best way that I can right now. In the future, I'm probably going to be able to say things a little bit more eloquently, but I am going to continue to explore the literature and be critical of it, and I really encourage you to do the same. So thank you for watching, everybody. And if you get the chance, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on that little notification bell so that you don't miss out on any new videos in the future. Have a great day, everybody. See you next time.